and welcome to episode 1 of Combating the Coronavirus. So yesterday I gave a brief introduction and I told you that the coronavirus can be classified in Chinese medicine terms as a damp plague. This absolutely makes sense when you think of it in terms of the symptoms that patients express when they come down with COVID-19. They produce excess amounts of phlegm and mucus within their respiratory tract, and this in turn obviously has an impact on their breathing and ultimately has an impact on their cardiovascular system as it puts it under pressure. So data is now showing that some people remain asymptomatic, but what can happen is they can end up with loss of smell and taste. And again, this makes perfect sense when you think of when you become congested, even with the common cold, that your nose becomes blocked, you can't smell, and ultimately you can't taste. And in Chinese medicine terms, this would be termed as damp, affecting the sensory or blocking the sensory orifices. So what can we do to combat the virus? It's really important that we know how to classify it now, because what we have to do is look and make our internal environment, that is the environment within our bodies, as inhospitable to the virus as possible. And one of the ways we can do that is to make sure that everything internally is running really well and that there's no internal damp there. Unfortunately, we live in an extremely damp climate, particularly in Ireland, and our diet is also quite damp. So we have to look at ways of mitigating this as much as we possibly can. And today I'm going to look at how we can do that through our diet. So we can do this in a two-pronged approach. The first would be to start to majorly reduce or to eliminate the damp-forming foods that we have in our diet. And the other is to look at foods that help us to eliminate damp and activate our circulation, and starting to increase the presence of those foods in our diet. So I'm going to be the bearer of bad news now. One of the primary damp-forming foods that we have in our diet, and this is even known from a Western medicine perspective, would be dairy. Dairy is extremely mucus forming. Most people who suffer with sinus problems or congestion will testify to that, myself being one of them. It's cow's dairy in particular, I suppose, I tend to focus on. That's because actually cow's dairy, in addition to being mucus forming, for about 80 to 90% of the population is actually highly inflammatory as well. And this is to do with the protein that's present in cow's dairy, which would be A1 casein, which the majority of us can't actually digest. But when it comes to mucus forming and damp, then I would be saying you need to either eliminate or severely reduce all forms of dairy for the moment. Bananas, unfortunately, and I love them, are another food. Not only are they damp forming and hard to digest for us, but they're also quite cold. And at the moment, what we want to do is we want to look at foods that are yang or warm in nature. I'm going to be checking on notes here because I'm not going to remember everything otherwise. So in Chinese medicine, we tend to categorize foods according to their thermal nature. So sweet and pungent foods tend to be yang in nature, which means they're hot or they're warming, and then sour, bitter and salty foods tend to be yin in nature, which means they're cooling or they're cold to our system. And what's really interesting is the first foods of spring tends to be pungent and sweet in nature. Therefore, they activate our qi, they clear heat from the body, they disperse cold if there's cold internally, and also they tend to move energy outwards and upwards to the surface of the body. So these would include flavours that are found in such things as chives, radishes, sweet peas, fresh spring greens, baby carrots and beets. And where possible, eat locally, because that's always what's good for us. If I was to give another blanket rule, it would be think about how you feel after you eat a particular food. Any food that makes your body feel sluggish, slow, lethargic, that's going to be a food that's damp for you, and that's a food to avoid. So what are the foods that we should be including in our diet? Well, in particular, they would be herbs and spices that are pungent in nature. You can have herbs that are pungent and warming, and also ones that are pungent and cooling, and also pungent and aromatic. And pungent and aromatic is probably the best place to go at this moment in time. That's because of the fact that they actually dispel damp, they can eliminate long-standing phlegm that's within your system, and they tend to activate our circulation and create movement in our system. So pungent and aromatic herbs would include things such as basil, rosemary, thyme, sage, cinnamon, nutmeg, cumin and cloves. I think I've also added spices in there, haven't I? So these are things that we should be adding to our foods. And when you think actually these are really good herbs as well, and spices that tend to cut through fats and help us to be able to digest animal fats. So these are what you should be including in your diet. And actually, if you stop to think about it, these are also herbs and spices that are known to have their antiviral and antibacterial effects and help us to cope with external pathogens. So that's it on my tips for today, and there'll be more coming. Thanks.